Welcome back to another episode of Autistic Stuff for Autistic People. Today, we're going to talk about autistic self-identification and formal diagnosis. This topic is highly visible in the broader autistic community, often very divisively, and we unsurprisingly each have a unique experience of it. As with our misdiagnosis episode, an upfront disclaimer: we are not doctors. We cannot tell you about the medical side of diagnosis or how to navigate it in ways that insurance will recognize. What we can tell you is how our experiences of self-identification or formal diagnosis have gone, how it has affected us, and how that has influenced our position and sense of self in the larger autistic community, and ongoing discussions around the merits and challenges of obtaining a formal autism diagnosis. I can start with describing my status, kind of in a nutshell. I call myself creatively autistic, in part because I am self-identified with peer review, which, sometimes I shorten to self-diagnosed, but, pedants might have an issue with that. It has been a very creative process to come to my current understanding of my neurology and my community. My mom self-identified when I was a young adult and eventually got a formal diagnosis for the sake of disability benefits. I haphazardly adapted knowledge from her experience to my own until I admitted I was just autistic without caveats at the age of 32, and also ADHD as well by a similar process. And I have no reason or desire to get a formal diagnosis at this point in my life. I have the self-confidence in my identification and the material resources that I need to avoid the hassle of a formal diagnosis. And whenever I doubt myself and get imposter syndrome, I just spend a little time with my autistic peers, and the peer review of my self-identification gets refreshed. So that's me in a nutshell.
I love that so much. And I love, ever since I met you, how much you've owned who you are based on your own inner lived experience. And it's just really a beautiful thing to watch. And it's so opposite of my experience. And I think that's why I get so much out of it. My journey is one of strong suspicion to then getting an official diagnosis. And I will talk later a little bit about why even that word diagnosis is, a really hard word to spit out. But for now, I'll just tell a little bit about my journey of getting that diagnosis, why I chose that route, and some of the pros and cons around it. So I discovered, or began to suspect, I should say, that I was autistic around the age of 40. And like many people, it was burnout that really started making me do some digging. And I was living in Nunavut at the time, which is Canada's far north. And it's very isolated, it's very remote. You have to fly in community, no roads connecting one community to the next. And I was teaching high school that school year. And it was really only 8 months because I started a little bit late in the school year. And it was just such a different environment for me. I'm far away from home, far away from family, trying to make new friends, trying to do a job that was extraordinarily stressful, filled with, students in my classrooms who many of them had experienced extreme trauma in their lives. Many were living in overcrowded homes. There was a lot going on, especially in the year right after, 2 years right after COVID. So there's a lot of stress. I was feeling constantly overwhelmed. I was emotionally dysregulated. One day I remember I was walking up the stairs at my school and I tripped and I burst into tears. And I was like, this isn't normal. Like, why am I sobbing in the middle of the day? Right. And I could not get a hold of my emotions. I would have to lay down every day after work. I only had enough energy to maybe make a small meal, watch some Netflix, or scroll social media. And this is where I started seeing videos and reading personal essays from late identified autistic women. And for the first time in my life, I was seeing myself in these stories. And I was like, oh my gosh, there are other people who are, experiencing life the way I do. And so I took the online autism quizzes and I, passed with flying colors. And when I returned home to Ontario, I contacted a neuropsychologist and set up an appointment and began testing for autism. And it took over a dozen hours of testing in person, as well as interviews with the psychologist, as well as the assessor. There was 2 people involved. And I paid like $3,500 out of pocket I went private because I didn't want to wait on a waiting list for years. And, you know, 3 years ago, on October 17th, 2022, I actually received my diagnosis of autism and ADHD. And people have asked me, like, why did you get an official diagnosis? You're an adult, right? It's not like you need anything for school, right? You're all finished that. Like, what was your motivation in going after that official diagnosis? And I'm going to tell you, the biggest thing is that after a lifetime of being taught not to trust myself or my own lived experience, I felt the absolute need to get an expert to validate what I knew deep down. And that's really hard to say now, 3 years later, how much I needed that external validation, how much I didn't trust myself. Without that official stamp of approval and agreement, I don't know that I would have believed myself. I felt like I wouldn't be believed by other people without an official diagnosis. Right? I remember even when I was strongly suspicious in my autism, when I was teaching in that last post that I told you about, I remember going up to my principal at the time saying, right, I'm pretty sure I'm autistic and I am having some really big challenges. Like, can we talk about this? And she's like, I don't know how to help you. And that was it. That was as far as it went. There was nothing else. There was no questions. There was no deep dive. There was no sit down. It was just, I hit a brick wall. And I felt like if I was going to be believed, if I was going to get any help in the future, I needed to have that piece of paper. That was somebody who had gone to medical school and could tell me that, yes, in fact, I am autistic. And I knew that I couldn't handle the thought of people asking me any questions about this journey and me kind of spitting out, well, I'm pretty sure I'm autistic, right? That was kind of like my big concern, right? At the time, I still believed in the medical model and the I can't say this word, the pathologization of autism. I felt like there was something wrong with me. So why wouldn't I go to a doctor? Right? It made perfect sense. And later on, the ideas around getting some government support or accommodations at work kind of entered the equation as well. But ultimately, it was a very deep inability to trust my own lived experience and the need to have that external validation by a quote unquote expert, because that's what I had needed my entire life, to trust anything that was internal. And I'd love to hear from Patrice, and then we could talk about like pros and cons.
Yeah, thank you to both of you. Thanks, Aradia and Cheryl, both for sharing your experiences. What struck out to me, Cheryl, the most from you is, needing that external validation. And, it makes so much sense to me. For me, that kind of worked out in a different way. I've talked in other podcast episodes about having quite a long healing journey. So I did a lot of different trauma therapies over the years and kind of used every tool in the book and still felt pretty bad. And so when I learned about autism and recognized myself completely, it was just such a relief and continues to be so. For me, I'd had so much experience feeling invalidated that I didn't want to put myself in one of those, the intense processes of getting diagnosed, because I didn't feel like I could handle it if someone tried to argue with me that I'm in fact not autistic after everything I'd been through and recognizing every characteristic in myself. So I did have a therapist for several years who I did trust, and she diagnosed me, but that wasn't the same as going through the multi-thousands of dollars diagnostic process. When I talked about it further with different coaches and therapists, what I really landed on was that for me, I felt that even if I got that complete diagnosis, I would then question if I could really trust the person who diagnosed me, or if I just have biases towards them, or think like, oh, they were like distracted that day, or like, what if I just got lucky and they diagnosed me and like someone else wouldn't have? And ultimately, I decided to just go with the diagnosis that my therapist, who I already know, trust, and have a relationship with, gave me, that I am in fact autistic, and that was enough for me and continues to be enough for me. So I feel pretty complete with that. I don't anticipate going through that process at any time, but that could change. And I really love how we have so much access now to learning about each other's autistic experiences, and how that, that we call it that peer diagnosis, the peer support diagnosis. It has just been so valuable to hear from other autistic people speak, what they share in books, on social media, and podcasts like this. I think that is just like so healing and medicinal to the community. So I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah. Thanks for letting me share.
Yeah. That's the thing, is the peer review. It's you get to try stuff out, you get to be in community with people, and you find what works and what doesn't. And that, yeah, it's a lot more good for your self-confidence. Obviously, it does not necessarily work to get the benefits that you might need from your workplace or your government or whatever, but it does work wonders for navigating daily life, like in your own head, and learning how to trust yourself. Peer review helps a lot with that.
So just Aradia, on that point, I will say that I've been able to access benefits from the diagnoses from my therapist. There are also other ancillary ways to access benefits just with a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or migraines, which are often co-occurring conditions for those of us, especially those who are late diagnosed. So just putting that out there as something that I've experienced as kind of a creative weave around as a way to still get needs met without that heavily expensive and time intensive diagnostic process.
Yeah, got to be creative about it.
That's really important. And I think that's important to just really reiterate that, everybody who's listening right now, it's going to, this answers to these questions about benefits and accommodations are going to be very unique to each person, depending on the job you have, the field that you're in, whether you're working or not, whether, you live in the United States or Canada, somewhere in Europe or beyond. Every country is very unique in their rules around this. So what works for one person might not work for somebody else. But I'd really like to go back to that word validation for a second here, because as you were talking, Patrice, about validation and invalidation, this thought popped into my head. In my efforts to get that external validation from a medical expert, right, and going through that whole process, both in time, energy, and money, very expensive, in some weird ways, I was trying to get validation, but the cost of that was that I had to walk in there and really like prove that I was broken in some ways. That's what it feels like sometimes. And I'm not saying that's the same for every person who goes through this experience. Like, some people have had amazing experiences with the process, and some people have had horrible ones. And even though I would not classify my experience as horrible, it's still really tricky to walk into an environment where people are focusing on a list of external traits that you have to see if you somehow can show them that you have. But no one was really focusing on my inner world. No one was really focusing on how I felt inside my inner lived experience. So it was one more situation and one more context where I was masking. I was performing for not just the validation, but for the diagnosis. And I'm not sure if that, I don't know if I've said that correctly, but that's kind of what it feels like when you are kind of working with that medical model of, well, deficit, disorder, right? These are the problem areas. These are the things that you struggle with. And not to say that we don't struggle and that we don't have these challenges, but when we use that kind of language and you're in that environment for hours and hours at a time, there's this bittersweet feeling for me when I got the diagnosis. Was I felt this relief, like, oh my God, this expert heard me or sees me, agrees with me. I must be autistic then, check mark. And then on the other side, that relief doesn't last very long, for me at least, right? Then it was anger and frustration. And how could people miss it for so long? And what did I have to do? Stand on a table and scream, I'm autistic, for people to notice? Like, what, all you start looking back at your whole life, and, it's a kind of a tongue in cheek, but, we go through those 5 stages of grief, and it's not linear, and it's very up and down. It can be very tumultuous. And I would say the diagnosis for me was just the launching point, because the last 3 years has been the deep dive into myself and, autistic peer support and community, and really learning to trust myself and who I am and how I feel, and being able to articulate that very, very poorly most of the time still, but, better than I used to. And connected to this whole validation issue is what happens when you go for an official diagnosis and they are wrong, right? Because this happened to somebody I'm very, very close to, and they are so similar to me. Like, we always joke, like, if I'm autistic, you're autistic. Like, there's just no question. And they went to a different medical, professional, and they went through all these hours of testing and all this money, and the expert, and I'm putting big quotes around that, said, yeah, you have anxiety, you're not autistic. And the crushing sense of like confusion and invalidation that they went through, I can't even put it into words. So there is that real danger in handing over our power to the medical profession, right? And I'm not saying that some of us don't have any other option. Some of us, if we need help and support and benefits and all those things, we might just have to do it. And I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but that is something to be aware of. Is, unless you are really, really sure of the person that you're going to who is assessing you, the false diagnosis can be crushing and very invalidating.
Yeah. And I would say, too, that this is a place where the various systemic biases of the medical system and our larger society really come into play. As we've mentioned on this podcast before, we're all white. So, we have that benefit, but, we also are all non-men. So we have that, disbenefit. But this is really where the unequal access on the basis of systemic bias, like, really comes in. If they are looking at your external presentation and who you managed to find on a good day at the doctor's office, like, that's going to be so contingent on where in the country you are and what your tax bracket is and what your race is. And, like, all of those things are going to really influence how you even get assessed, right? If you are poor and non-white and you're a little rowdy, that is so much more likely to be seen as criminal behavior than as something that can be medically diagnosed. And that's even before we get to the pathologizing framework you were talking about. So again, there's a lot of, there's a lot of holes in your personality that can be drilled by going through a formal diagnostic process with all of the issues that we're attempting to articulate.
And in this current environment, though, just to add on to what you're saying, there is danger for a lot of people to get onto a list of, people who are autistic, right? That can be a concern in a lot of different communities. And that should be really acknowledged that, not everyone has the luxury of even going to get this diagnosis in the first place because of the barriers that you just mentioned. But not everyone is going to feel safe to do so. And that's also valid as well. Sorry, Patrice, I did not mean to cut you off there. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I just appreciated Aradia naming all the systemic biases and constraints there, and wanted to just touch too on, Cheryl, what you described as, to do this requires having to describe all the ways our life is hard and even traumatic to a complete stranger in a way of kind of like, please let me convince you how bad it is. So you'll just give me this, so you'll give me this diagnosis, and just the vulnerability of that. I personally am a pretty private person, so I don't like to share those things unless I really know and trust the other person. So it's a challenging environment to put oneself in to even acquire that diagnosis. And also, as you were kind of touching on too, Cheryl, so much of what we see as autism is a description of an autistic person in distress and the symptoms that happen when the person's in distress. And, I haven't been through this myself, but I'd be really curious to know, are there questions like, are you really good at, noticing details others miss? Are you really good at just like having a really intrinsic sense of motivation and curiosity that has you constantly learning and enjoying, tiny things that other people take for granted? Like all these beautiful parts of autism. Were those on your diagnostic process? Questions that touched on the beauty?
Right. Have you ever prevented a house fire because you could hear the buzzing in the wall?
definitely like, because there's so many different questionnaires, right? And so many like always, sometimes, usually like those horrible graded scale things. And there definitely, I think there were some questions like that, Patrice, in terms of, attention to detail and some of those things that we might consider to be positives. And there were some things that were testing like memory and attention and vocabulary and things that you may be very high in, for some people. One of my favorites is the flying frogs. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. You are given a book and there's no words in this book. And it is pictures of frogs and they're flying, sometimes on little carpets and whatnot. And the assessor will start telling the story. And like it's a script, they will start telling the story. And then you have to finish the story. So you literally have to come up with a world and a backstory and these characters and why they're doing what they're doing. And for the longest time after that, I was like, did I pass? Did I fail? Like everything was such a binary. Like I didn't know what they were actually testing. And, some people, I really don't know for sure. I have heard it said that they're much less interested in what you say than in how you say it. So like, are you connecting with the listener? Are you able, like, what is your body language in that moment, right? It's not just like, oh, are you a good storyteller? So there's so many tests that you don't know what you're being tested on. And sometimes you never know. You're just like, right? I mean, I had one test where they literally handed me different toys, little items, like a little race car, like a feather, different little items. Tell me a story. Use the items to tell me a story, right? So you talk about, one, not knowing why you're doing what you're doing. You talk about feeling like you're on display and you're being like, examined under a microscope. All sorts of things come up for me, like fear of failure, fear of being observed, fear of being criticized, fear of feeling stupid, right? So all of those things are coming up at the same time. And it's like, for me, it was a really exhausting process. It was really exhausting. And the one thing I will add on is all three of us are talking about this from the perspective of being adults. This conversation will probably be very different if you are the parent of a child, right? There's lots of reasons why you may want to get a child officially diagnosed in terms of getting help throughout, the school years and getting access to different, occupational therapists and all sorts of services in your community. But at the same time, sometimes some families will say, you know what, maybe it's not worth it. I can't speak to that because I'm talking about it from my experience as an adult. And as exhausting as it was, I really did think, oh, it's going to help me access services. There's not as much as you might think. So that's another piece of the puzzle. Depending on where you are, you can go through all of this and still not get all of the help and support that you need, right? And again, all those systemic things that Aradia, you were saying, will affect how much of that help you're able to access. I think that's important to notice too.
Oh, so frustrating. I'm struck by how you described you're tested and not given context for the questions that you're asked. And it seems there's some room for improvement around this process, given that autistic people often do a lot better when they're provided context for anything.
Yeah.
No. It's a very clear list of instructions. You can't even really ask. You can ask them to repeat it, but like there's not like a lot of explanations provided, even if you wanted them.
Not very neuro-inclusive for this neurodivergent exam, is it?
Maybe it's because they know they can only identify autism at its maximum distress expression. And so they're like, we have to make this as distressing as possible in order to get a good test result.
I guess so.
The interesting part, though, after I got assessed and I eventually got my full report, right? Because part of it was like I wrote 16 pages myself of like self-reporting about my lived experience. So I am very lucky in that she took that under serious consideration before I even began my testing. But afterwards you get this, this report, and I was reading it, and what I find really fascinating is when they notice things that you never really knew.
That part.
Right? Like, so when somebody like one of the assessors will say like, oh, person did not make eye contact. And like, I don't know. I don't think I even noticed that I wasn't, right? It's just, there's so many things that are just such a part of my experience that I couldn't name them, but it's just interesting to read like somebody else's observations of your experience.
What was that like for you, Cheryl, given that so many of us autistics don't particularly enjoy being perceived? And here you are being perceived at a very
maximum perception.
Yeah.
It, it's funny. Like I kind of sometimes gloss over the experience because I go from like, I was in burnout. I know I needed to get a diagnosis. So I went and then I got my diagnosis and then I found Matthew. Yay. Like, and then these past 3 years, I've been like connecting with people, and I do sometimes jump over like the stress involved in that process, right? Like I don't drive. So I had somebody that needed to drive me to these appointments, right? We can only do them in 3-hour segments. So I had to go 4 or 5 times, right? I'm exhausted afterwards, right? Feeling confused was very triggering because, like, if I don't know why I'm doing something, I get so like, well, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Like, even those graded scales, well, I don't know. Is it always? Is it usually? I don't know. So there was so much second guessing of myself, so much feeling like I was back 5 years old, sitting in a classroom. All right, like, I mean, I was literally getting flashbacks of being in grade 2 and my teacher yelling at me because I didn't understand a question. Like, so, you know, pros and cons, pros and cons, I will say.
Wow, I'm just so sorry that happened to you. It does sound extremely stressful. And at the same time, I'm grateful that you were able to get the diagnosis that you needed. So I just wanted to let our listeners know that I need to step off a little early today. And so I'm going to do that now. So you won't hear my voice again for the remainder of the podcast, but I will be back soon. And thanks for listening. And Aradia and Cheryl, I'll see you soon as well.
Other aspects of this that are, I think, important to bring to the discussion. One of them is something I feel like we've kind of been elephant in the room tiptoeing around, but the concept of like the grass is greener paradox. Like you have real autism, you got a diagnosis, you got the validation, versus you haven't had to go through that, you haven't been put on a list, you haven't been pathologized. Like I feel like both sides of this, we are prone to thinking that the grass is greener on the other side. I think it's worth naming that the fact of the matter is the grass is as green as it is in a bunch of different locations, and it really depends on your context and why you have the diagnosis that you have. And there's no universal answer for what is better. It's really dependent on your circumstances and resources and the people around you, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's very personal, and I thank you for naming that, Aradia. This idea of grass, that the grass is greener, right? And sometimes it's between, self-identification versus official diagnosis, but sometimes it's something like, oh, that person got identified when they were young.
Yeah.
That must have made it so much easier for them growing up. Well, did it? We don't know. For some it might, and for some it might make it completely harder, right? And there's some people who, the flip side, oh, well, you got to live your whole life not knowing, so you got to have like quote unquote normal experiences, and you didn't find out till you were 40. Like, your experience is your experience, and whatever happened for you is completely, valid. I think we can learn from other people's experiences. And, like, even you guys were asking me questions about my diagnosis procedure. And, as much as I was talking about how stressful it was and overwhelming, I still had a really good experience compared to so many that I have heard from, right? I did have people coming at me, at least from, to the extent that they could, a neuroaffirming perspective. I did have people who understood that, like, I needed to take breaks. I did have, like, those accommodations built in. And I've heard some really, really challenging stories from people who did not have those experiences. And, so I can never say you should or shouldn't get a diagnosis, or you should or shouldn't self-identify. It is going to be so unique to each person. And I think that grass is greener part is really part of that. I think also we should talk about the internalized ableism piece.
Yes, we should, because that's so huge.
How is that showing up for you?
I mean, it really is the root of why the rallying cry of self-diagnosis is valid is so important. And like, it's kind of weird. We've gotten 30 minutes into this without saying it, but let me just say it for the record. Self-diagnosis is super duper valid. But the reason we need that statement is because there is a lot of invalidation that comes from outside, from the pathology paradigm, from a world that's set up to revere men in lab coats as the, gatekeepers of all knowledge. But also, right, we all exist in a society that has very intense opinions about how we should view ourselves, and we do internalize those. And it's the work of a lifetime to unpack, our sense of whiteness, of capitalism, of nationalism, of ableism, right? Ableism is a huge part of that. And so I mean, like I said in my opening spiel, my mom was diagnosed when I was a young adult. I believe I was 12 when I learned what autism was, and that explained why my mom was, a feral artist in the woods. Yeah, I was 32. So if you do the math, that is 20 years later that I was able to say, I am autistic, full stop. I don't need to have caveats. I don't need to dance around it. I don't need to say, oh, I'm just a little quirky. I am autistic. Whole sentence. It took me 20 years. 20 years of, I'm not exactly, a bit of literal thinking, right? A bit of, I'm not a musical savant, so I can't be autistic. Like there's a little of that, but there's also the shame. When I suggest this to someone and they say, oh, well, at least you're high functioning, right? When I look at the challenges some people are having and think, well, I don't have those challenges. I have other challenges, but maybe I just need to suck it up, right? All of those scripts that start out entirely subconscious, that it's what took me 20 years to come around to the fact that I've known I was autistic this whole time. So the ableism definitely shows up in a lot of self-doubt. I mean, you were talking about not trusting yourself, right? Like that, there was a lot of that of like, do I know what I feel? Do I not want to do this? Or am I just waiting for someone else to tell me how to do it? Like, and I'm still unpacking that. There's still so much of that. But yeah, it's really shown up for me in wasting my time on making bullshit excuses for why I can't do what feels good, I guess would be the short way to say that. How about for you?
That's really powerful. And honestly, as you were talking, I was thinking about my experience with internalized ableism as well. And I think a lot of it is tied into gaslighting. And so for me, that showed up in very small ways at first, right? Like when you're a child and something is way too loud, or it's too bright, or it's too hot, or something along those lines. And you get told, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. You're okay. You're fine. And inside, I'm not fine. Inside, it feels like I'm being stabbed in my eardrums because it's so loud. Or it feels like I'm going to internally combust because my body can't regulate its temperature. And I'm getting this piercing headache because I was out in the sun. So when you take that as a collective of experience, right, that whole collection, I should say, the collection of experiences, it kind of, you get to that endpoint where you're like, oh, I have never trusted myself. I have never really trusted that what I was experiencing was real. And just because it was different from somebody else, it was still real to me. And in order to, I guess, be accepted or to fit in or to feel normal, and I'm saying that again with big quotation marks around it because that word is bogus to begin with. But in order to feel like I belonged, I tried to be what I thought was expected of me, right? Which is able-bodied. It is functional. It is able to produce. It is able to perform. It is able to take those emotions, those big emotions that you're feeling in a given moment, and shove them down because we got stuff to do, places to go, people to see. And it's really uncomfortable for everyone around you when you're feeling so deeply and you're sensing things that nobody else can sense. And you're, experiencing such high levels of both joy and sadness and grief because you feel things in the extreme, right? When, you're eating the same thing for the 5th day and you're as happy as a clam and people think that you're weird. Like all of those things, they're tiny in themselves and by themselves, they're so tiny. But when you've experienced it hundreds, if not thousands of times in your life, it just becomes to the point where people aren't going to believe me anyways. So I'm going to be as perfect as possible. I'm going to be as able-bodied as possible. And so it probably took me until this year. And the reason I'm saying this is because I have this so-called important official diagnosis that supposedly makes me immune to imposter syndrome. It took me until this year, after 3 years of community and support and learning, to really get the words out of my mouth that I am disabled. Because I have spent the last 3 years pretending it's not that bad. That maybe if I just tried a little bit harder and maybe, if I got a new planner, if I got a new approach to life, like whatever it was, I just thought, it's not that bad. I've pushed through everything else in my life. I've survived. I'm still standing. All those lovely pithy quotes, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, which is absolute nonsense.
What doesn't kill you gives you gray hairs and a twisted sense of humor.
And a little bit of CPTSD. It's fine. It's fine.
That too.
Right? And for those who don't hear sarcasm, we are being very sarcastic right now. So, all of that for me combined into my ableism, right? I need to perform able-bodiedness. I need to perform productivity. I need to perform usefulness in the ways that I was taught to be useful. And none of that leaves room for, oh my God, I really don't think I can do this. I'm not capable of this. I need a break, or I need to say no.
Oh man, you're reminding me of something I was thinking about like literally half an hour before we got on this call about performing ability. Because for me, for a very long time, something I'm really working on unpacking, I've been in this place of, well, if I know I'm autistic and it's not that bad, that means that I can just adapt through it. I know strategies, and so that's going to allow me to circumvent my autism. There's a lot of circumventing my autism, I think, in my I can make a 40-hour work week if I work at home, if I'm wearing comfortable pants. Then I can perform my 40 hours. No, I can't. And I was literally thinking about this before the call of just like, how is it that I am so exhausted by the, couple of Zoom calls a day that I do? Only 4 days of the week. And it's like, how am I supposed to expand my business to what it should be if this is how tired I am from the calls I have to do? And I should be able to do better, a number of hours in the day, blah, 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 blah. And just, yeah, kind of coming to that realization of like, I'm autistic, which means disabled, which means cannot perform to standards set by big external arbitrary capitalist system. Like, I'm still really struggling to keep that loop closed for more than a few seconds at a time. It's so easy for me to fall back off again.
I want to put all of that on a t-shirt right now, because what you said about the shoulds, like, I never thought of it quite that way before, but that every time we're saying should, there very well is probably some aspect of ableism involved. And that can be possibly something that I could start to observe in a different way. All right. I should be okay. Like, so for example, Canadian Thanksgiving this weekend. And so we celebrated on a couple days ago. And there's 22 people in my family. And I was having a really hard time having 22 people in my house. As much as I love them all, and the kids were even all getting along, it was just so loud. And it's hard for me to follow different conversations that are happening in different, parts of the room. And I just felt there's a part of me, just for a moment, I felt like such a failure. Like, this is my family. I love them. I should be able to handle this, right? I should be able to enjoy this completely. And so starting to understand that two things can be true can be helpful, right? Like, yes, I'm extraordinarily overwhelmed right now, and I'm enjoying being around my family and like the delicious food, and I can be grateful for that. And it's really hard, right? And it's really hard. So like, should tied to ableism is really important. I think when you mentioned that, I was like, ooh, aha moment. And the other thing I wrote down when you were talking was the adapting to perform. We are, like, for me, I am adapting my schedule, like you said, right? Adapt this, let me compartmentalize do blocks of time. Let me figure out some life hacks, right? Let me try all of the different advice that gets put out there in order to optimize your time forgetting for a second that most of that advice is for neurotypicals, and then realizing, oh God, none of this is working for a reason. But I've been adapting to perform, not adapting to care for myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that's huge, and that is tied into internalized ableism. That's hugely connected to that internalized ableism, and it's yeah, I don't know. I feel like we could have a whole other episode on ableism, but I'm gonna stop there. It's just recognizing it is one piece, and then figuring out how am I going to bring in some softness and some compassion and care, not in order to be productive, but in order to remind myself that I have value even as I sit here, right? That I don't have to be productive in order to get value. And like that, you talk about the work of a lifetime, like that's something. Oh boy.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I mean, this is the thing, this is the double-edged sword of it, right? Because you do want to make adaptations and changes to your life to better support your nervous system, to better support your material wealth, your physical health, your social connections. Like, you shouldn't just live in the dysfunction that you first had the revelation in. You should be seeking strategies and talking to people and trying stuff out, making changes, experimenting. Like, that is all so critical to this work of a lifetime. But yeah, check your motivations. Are you doing this so that you can perform a 40-hour work week or perform dutiful daughter duties? Or are you doing it because like you have hives because your cortisol is too high and you need to find ways to bring that cortisol down so you can stop having hives every time the mailman knocks or whatever it is, right? Like there's a both and. There's always a both and. You can't just wallow in the one state, but you can't optimize for an externally imposed capitalist system either. There's a space in between.
Yeah. It's huge, right? And it goes back to that big question. Are you resting because you are worthy of rest and you need rest and that fuels our creativity and all the things that are good in this world? Or are you resting in order to go on and be more productive again? Right? It's in both cases, we need rest, but one can be restorative. One can be a part of reminding ourselves how valuable we are just as we are. And one will feel like another chore. One will feel like something else on your to-do list. And yeah, and all, like I said, like all of this, we've gone off into like a bit of a tangent here on internalized ableism, but we went off on that tangent because it's huge in getting any sort of identification or diagnosis. It's huge in this conversation of who is autistic and who is not. It's huge in accepting our understanding of ourselves as autistic people. It's huge in dismantling those internalized, capitalistic ableism structures that keep us performing and keep us exhausted. So I feel like this is kind of a cool way to end it with this talk of internalized ableism, because it's one of the things that probably, in my opinion, it does kind of cross over whether you've gotten a self-identification or an official diagnosis. Internalized ableism is something that we're all going to be dealing with at some point, no matter which path we took on understanding our autism. And whether we have a piece of paper or not, it really doesn't matter in the sense of how do we feel inside? What beliefs are we still holding on to inside, and how are those beliefs affecting how we show up in the world and how we show up for ourselves?
Yeah. And to really wrap that all up, I would say that this is where having a community of autistic peers is the most important end result of either self-identification or formal diagnosis, because a formal diagnosis will give you a list of reasons to feel bad about yourself and no support. And self-diagnosis will leave you doom scrolling. You have to join a community either way in order to start moving forward with that information, in order to get strategies, get feedback, get a sense of what other autistic people that you jive with are like. Either way, that is where you're going to start unpacking the ableism and noticing the gaslighting and finding that one weird trick that, 9 out of 10 doctors hate or whatever it is, like community is where it is. The peer review of either form of identification, the peer support of either pathway into this space, like that is really the most important thing. Wherever you're at in this process, if you don't have community, that is your next step. And if you do have community, awesome. super glad. I hope that you're part of our community because, it's a big community. There's a lot of room in this tent. Yeah. And we're awesome. I think we're pretty awesome. So with that, I should probably wrap us up. So yeah, there we have it. A friendly and autistic discussion around self-identification versus formal diagnosis of being autistic and what that all means. We talked about internalized ableism and gatekeepers and the pathology paradigm and lots of other topics that have come up before and will come up again on this podcast because really it's just all the same giant topic that we're trying to talk through every week. So thank you for being here. And as a reminder, we are all peer support coaches within the Autistic Peer Support Coaching Collective, offering a variety of free and paid intentionally autistic spaces. You can learn more and follow us at our website, autisticcoaches.com. You can support us by sharing the podcast with your friends, peers, and anyone who lives with, works with, or loves an autistic person, or a person questioning if they're autistic. Thank you for listening to us talk about autistic stuff for autistic people. New episodes come out on alternating Mondays. Keep the conversation going on our Blue Sky feed or send us your constructive comments and feedback via email at autisticstuffpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, try to stop gaslighting yourself. A little more self-trust. Autistic Stuff for Autistic People is a production of Fox and Draven Media. For more podcasts from Fox and Draven Media, visit our website, foxanddravenmedia.com.